So most liberals are considered private, in other words.
Private?
Liberals.
They believe in private property, but they don't believe that the capitalism should just do whatever it wants.
Yeah, but like, for example, like if they vote, like the Republicans and Democrats, and they have another party that.
We've only got two parties that ever really run. Never third. All right, folks, here we go. We're doing chapter 26 today, part 1. It's a long one, so let's get going. Hopefully this recording is working, but one never knows. One never knows. It's like one disappointment after another, as I've mentioned on many occasions. No, I'm not going to say it, because you know what I was going to say, but I'm not going to say it. All right, here we go. So when I first talk about some of the major themes that took place in the years of President Richard Nixon, and then we're going to talk about what's known as the end of the golden age, which means the economy collapses in the early to mid-'70s for a variety of reasons, and what were the consequences of this economic, not depression, but recession. It slows down after an expansion that started with World War II up until the early 70s. So let's talk about Richard Nixon. Who is Richard Nixon? Well, Richard Nixon, as you know, was President Eisenhower's vice president in the 1950s. He ran for president in 1960 against John F. Kennedy and lost. And thereafter, he was very, very upset. He ran for governor of California in the 60s, lost, and everyone thought his political career was in the tank. But then, in 1968, the Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive. It was very successful, and it showed that President Johnson, a Democrat, had been lying about how successful the Vietnam War was. He was humiliated. He chose not to run for president, and so it opened up the field to anybody who was running. The Democrat who ran that year, whose name now escapes me, but it was Johnson's vice president, Humphrey, was not great, but he wasn't awful. But Nixon was a known commodity, and Nixon was the guy who spoke for all those people that said, I am tired of the radicals, the revolutions, the rebellions, the marches, the demonstrations, civil rights, women. I'm tired of it. I am the guy that will be elected for the people who just go to work, pay their taxes, and obey the law. And a lot of those people came out to vote for Nixon, and he won by a razor-thin majority. Now, his domestic and foreign policy was rather mixed. And even though he was the beginning of the conservative transformation in American politics, he still got his education under the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt that believed government does do good things. It's not all bad. For instance, he created a number of regulatory agencies like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. He believed government should, in fact, regulate how much pollution is caused by corporations before we kill the planet we live on. That came to us from a conservative Republican president. He also created OSHA, O-S-H-A, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which OSHA basically says there has to be certain rules to the workplace. Otherwise, people shouldn't be treated. There should be some rules as to what businesses can and cannot impose on their workers in terms of quality of work life. And let's see, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB. This is the one that regulated how cars were built because there were so many accidents in cars in the 1960s. So all of this is government regulating industry, which Ronald Reagan was very uncomfortable with, and Nixon was fine with, because Nixon was this transition president from the liberal presidents before to the conservative presidents that came after. What else did he do? The Clean Air Act, so that he could limit how much pollution is pumped into the skies, and so on and so forth. But Nixon did have a conservative side. He was a Republican. So, for instance, he believed in a new federalism. What does that mean? It means that he would give money directly to the states to spend as they see fit, with as little rules as possible from the federal government, because he, like Reagan, believed True freedom comes from the state governments who knows exactly what their people want. So he just gave money directly to the states, no strings attached, for everything. He also started nominating very conservative judges to the Supreme Court. Judges that had segregationist or pro-racist, white supremacist pasts. Because he knew you put them on the Supreme Court becomes more conservative. And in terms of affirmative action, he came out against it. The 1960s was all about expanding affirmative action. The 1970s under Nixon was all about, this is not good, we are giving money to poor people to just stay at home and not work. This was calculated to appeal to white voters, working class voters, that tend to vote Democrat, but who, by 1970s, were starting to feel that their hard-earned money was being spent on welfare projects, and they didn't agree with that. And he was incredibly successful. Go.
So, a combination of nominating conservative judges and actually him being representative inside of the
Yeah.
process.
He was the beginning of that conservative revolution, which culminates in Reagan, the various George Bush's politicians, George Bush presidencies, but even some of the policies of our Democratic presidents, like Clinton. He fundamentally changed welfare.
So, it's safe to say that Nixon was really big on civil rights.
Not much. And proof of that is here. He nominated Warren Burger to replace Earl Warren as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Warren Burger was way more conservative than Earl Warren. Earl Warren is the one that gave us things like the Roe v. Wade abortion ruling and the Miranda rights, etc. Warren Burger was way more conservative. So in terms of, there was a variety of rulings that came out of the Burger Court that had a mixed ideology, which showed this transition from a liberal to a conservative court. For instance, in 1971, in a court case, the court ordered busing to integrate schools, meaning, in order to integrate schools, the court said you have to bus wealthier kids from the suburbs into the inner cities to go to public school with poor minority children, and vice versa. So you have real integration. People are actually going to school together. This unleashed a huge protest from, predictably white parents in the suburbs, especially South Boston, which is rather disappointing since I'm pretty close to that city. But then a couple of years later, the court just changes its mind and says that you don't have to bus your kids into the inner city in order to integrate schools. So on the one hand, they were for integration, and on the other hand, they changed their mind. In terms of affirmative action, they basically were against it. They, let's see. They rejected the idea that you could have fixed racial quotas, but said you can take considerations of race into account when hiring, which means, in the past, part of affirmative action says, listen, your city is like 30% African American. You should at least be able to hire 15% of your workforce that's African American, and that was, enforced. Now, under Nixon, that sort of looked unfavorably upon, and it's just, you should take into consideration the racial makeup of your workforce, which when you do that, people don't do that at all. You have to mandate it. Now, but regardless of what Nixon was doing in the Supreme Court, regardless of the laws that he was passing, regardless of Nixon's relationships with the state governments, the people on the ground were transforming themselves socially, in some sectors, into a more liberal direction, specifically when it came to sex. And by sex, I don't mean just the act of having sex, but just how people viewed sex. The 1960s was all about people are going to have sex because they want to, not because they just only to have children. It was the sexual revolution. By the 1970s, this wasn't a revolution anymore. By the 1970s, most people commonly expected that you would not wait until you were married to have sex with someone. Now, regardless of the morality of what you think about that, that was what was happening in the 1970s. People were not marrying the first person they had sex with. They had premarital sex. And with Roe v. Wade and legal contraception, this was now a possibility. Divorce rates went up. The 1960s was all about women's rights and individualism and what's good for you. Well, by the 1970s, a lot of women thought, you know what? What's good for me is not this marriage. And socially, it was considered inappropriate to get a divorce. But now we've come to accept that individual happiness is more important than doing what the society thinks is normal. And so my individual happiness is being disadvantaged by being married to this schlub. So by 1975, new marriages were outnumbered by divorces. By 1975, there were more divorces than new marriages. I think that's sort of tapered off. Marriages were also happening later in life. With more and more women going to school, having children later, having less children, people were just getting married later and later in life. And look at this number. In 1976, the average birth rate was down to 1.7 child per woman. 1.7 child per woman in 1976. In 1957, 20 years earlier, it was more than twice that number. So the number of children that women were having was less than half in just a 20-year period. What else was happening? All that struggle for women's rights in the 60s and early 70s turned into law, specifically Title IX. Title IX, federal law that banned gender discrimination in higher education, meaning you can't keep women out of colleges and grad school and law school just because they're women. You have to admit them based on their qualifications. It was now a law. You couldn't discriminate based on gender in higher education. The result, of course, was an explosion of women going to college, medical school, law school, graduate school, getting PhDs and everything. But something else about Title IX was it also banned discrimination when it came to sports and funding. So what does that mean? In the 1970s, all of a sudden, colleges were told, you can't give the men's football team 80% of the sports budget for the, I don't know, University of Wisconsin. No, it's a stupid example. University of Michigan. And then give women's field hockey 2%. You can't. It has to be more evenly divided. So what happened? The stereotype was, well, why would you fund women's sports? But women don't like sports. Just like women don't like to go to college. Why would you want them to go to college? As I look on a class where 80% of my students are women. The stereotype was, why would we give more money to women's sports when women don't play sports? Well, what happened when you gave equal funding to women's sports? Well, all of a sudden, women's soccer exploded. Women's wrestling, martial arts, field hockey, football, ice hockey exploded because the opportunities were there. And I say that just, I think, about a month away from the Women's World Cup Soccer Championship, which is in Canada, my home country. So what else do we need to know? All right, I think we're going good. So in the 1970s, also saw an explosion of women in the workplace because of the end of this gender discrimination. There was endless lawsuits saying you're not hiring women. Corporations lost these lawsuits, so now they started hiring women en masse in the 1970s. In 1960, think about it, women with children in the workforce, 20%. 1960, women with children that were also working, 20%. In 1990, that number is up to 55%. And of course, today that number is even higher. The 1970s was also a tremendous move forward for gay and lesbian liberation. I talked about last class the Stonewall Inn riots in, I think, 68, unless I'm forgetting it. And I also mentioned last class the first gay pride marches happened a few years after the Stonewall riots, and then immediately they became very, very popular. So for instance, let me give you a number. In 1969, 1 year after the Stonewall Inn riots, there was only 50 known gay civil rights groups across the country. In 1969, 1 year after Stonewall. In a few years later, the numbers were now in the thousands. You couldn't even keep track of how many were now expanding. The 1970s was increasingly the time that people did not really care about sexuality, your choices, your behavior. It was very much a concept of, it's not my business, it's your business. And people were more and more comfortable fighting for their rights on these issues. Another consequence of this is that the American Psychiatric Association finally removed homosexuality from its list of mental diseases. The American Psychiatric Association once categorized being gay as a mental disease. Think about that.
I'm sorry, Professor.
Go ahead.
Can I ask something?
You can ask anything you want.
I saw something, I forgot what was it, like a month ago in the news about some guy that supposedly hurt people, like in the present day. They put him like in some kind of psychiatric clinic, doing like for him to prevent him to become gay.
Yes, that still goes on. That's why President Obama went on TV about a week ago and said, what is it, anti-gay therapy is not good. You can't, it's not like that. It isn't a matter, okay, let me put it to you this way. I'm sure you're aware of the amount of grief, violence, abuse, discrimination, laughing, joking that gay men and women go through, right? From teenagers to adults, right? Why would anybody willingly choose to lead this life? This gay therapy thing is all about you can choose not to be gay. So I posit to you this question. Why would someone choose to go through a life of endless abuse, ridicule, violence, and sometimes murder? Why would you choose that? But President Obama is on his way out the office, so he's now comfortable saying everything on his mind. And in response to the weekend's other killing of a black man at the hands of the police, or at least not the killing, but the death of this black man in Baltimore. Do you know about the story?
Yeah.
Of course you do. He went on TV and said, basically, this is not a new thing. This has been going on for a while, right? Which you would be a lot less comfortable saying a little while ago. Go ahead.
Remember what, I don't know if you remember when I said that now people only protest when it comes to a racial thing?
Go ahead. People only...
Protest when it comes to like, when it's
yes.
something that it has to do with race, when it's something that has to do with the police and like individuals.
Yes.
Right now, like, they saw what went down in Missouri. They didn't help, they didn't fix anything by rioting and destroying their city. They're doing the same thing now. And it's like, do you not get the point? You are showing nationwide.
They want you to know. They want us to see that. So
right.
They're showing all negativity, but it's some positivity going down. And
but here's the connection, though. Here's the connection. You start off with, you see the videos of people being shot, black men being shot, and everyone's sad about that. And then you match it with the rioting, and everybody is upset with that, right? But very few times do we ever have conversations about why do these people feel the natural need when the restrictions of law enforcement are loosened, or they feel courage in a group to rebel in such a fashion. Well, looting has some connection to poverty, right? And if the poverty is concentrated in these neighborhoods, there's no looting on the Upper West Side in a blackout. It just doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. The last time we had the last blackout we had in New York City, everybody was remarkably well behaved. Everybody hung out on the street in their patio furniture in every city. There was no looting. But that conversation doesn't always happen. Why does this level of pent-up violence break out? Like, why does it happen? And my answer is, well, it's been pent up for a while, which is what President Obama is saying. But, is it productive? Not so much, because everyone who's watching TV is saying, well,
That's
Now
the
what are we
reason
gonna do?
why- No, and it's like, I feel like it's showing a side, like, we're all being labeled right now. We have been labeled for years, but it's showing a side that makes other people think, well, that's why they're getting killed. Look at the way they're behaving. They're behaving like savages. They're behaving like that.
Right.
And that is not the
And that
picture
is-
that we are supposed to be giving.
Right, but that is also the media's issue.
Right. It was lynching back then, and now they're angry. They're angry, and unfortunately, they're not educated enough to
So that's my thing.
try to
Go to
express
school
it
and
a better way. But it's easy to say that when you don't have that kind. If your parents didn't go to school and your parents' parents didn't go to school, they're not going to enforce you to go to school.
My parents didn't go to school, and trust me,
But
I'm
then
in
you see a change.
Right,
You see
but
a change.
remember-
You want something better, but everybody is not like that.
But here's what I'm
That's the
saying.
problem.
There are individuals that push through the limits, right? Not everyone does. Not everyone does. And that's where the crux of the matter is. We need to, it would be great if everybody was like you or me. Like, I'm the first one in my family that got a PhD. I'm the first one. I'm one of the few that got a college degree. Most of my people work. They just, they work. They're like working class people. It doesn't make me smarter. That was just what I wanted to do, right? But public policy is not about recognizing the individual. It's about making sure most people that try, make it. And that's the problem, because public policy in this country is problematic. It is public, and then I think we got to keep going, but this is critical. This is critical because what you all are talking about is presentation by the media, which poisons the debate, stuff that is left unsaid, which leads to the stuff which you see on the media, because it is much easier to show a 5-minute clip of rampaging people, which gives you that image of there's a problem. But how do you film and share with the public years upon years of stop and frisk, racial profiling, discrimination at the workplace? That kind of stuff you can't put in a 5-minute clip on TV, right? And that's the stuff that public policy is supposed to fix, right? Which is where Nixon, for instance, was a little mixed. Some of the stuff he recognized, but at this time he started getting that set. Like, he was playing to those people watching the TV who saw all those rioters against, like, the war in Vietnam, and they were thinking, like, what the hell? Why are all these people challenging the government? Remember, this was still a generation of people that liked to follow. So, but let me talk about some other stuff which is interesting. I could talk about this forever, but it's not going to be on the final exam. Right? Well, I could, but then, I would be in trouble. Now, foreign policy. Where Nixon was mixed on domestic policy, and foreign policy he was pretty interesting. Because on foreign policy, he did stuff that nobody expected. For instance, on the one hand, he did stuff which all of the presidents have done. We will support any government as long as they support American interests, whether they're democratic or dictatorships. And so, Nixon had no problem supporting the dictatorships of Iran, the Philippines, and South Africa. Why? Because they were anti-communist, pro-American. He also supported the overthrow of governments which he considered to be communist or maybe too familiar to communism. Chile elected Salvador Allende as president in 1970. He was a socialist. He believed government should regulate the economy to help poor people, right? The CIA got involved in Chile, worked with his opponents, and on September 11th, 1973, Allende was overthrown and murdered. The replacement was the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, who pretty much went after all of his political opponents, some of them Americans, tortured and executed them. Chile only came out of dictatorship recently. So this was the predictable side. You got to take a stand against communism, right? The more realistic side that everyone was surprised by was what Nixon did with the communist powers of China and Russia. All presidents before Nixon believed that all communists are the same. Vietnam, China, Cuba, Russia, they're all the same. They're all communists. Nixon, however, recognized, because of the advice of his foreign policy advisor, that they're not the same. China and Russia actually hate each other. They have a long, continuous border, They're always fighting border skirmishes. They hate each other. Whether they're communists or not, they hate each other. So why don't you work with one of them in order to get an advantage over the other? So he did. He went to China. This president that was the most anti-communist president we've ever had flew to China and sat down with the head of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, and he said, let's do business. He recognized, I hate you, you hate me, but neither one of us are going anywhere, so let's do business. What do you want? What do I want? What did they both want? They wanted the beginnings of economic relationships between China and America. So right now, what you see as the exploding Chinese economy and the fact that China owns most of our debt, it started when Nixon went to China in when the hell was it? 72, I think.
Everything is made in China.
Yes, absolutely. The other thing he did was he went to Russia. He went to Russia also in 1972. After he visited China and he got a deal with the Chinese, he went to the Russians and he said, I've just made friends with the Chinese, which you hate. So what are you going to do to buy my friendship? And the Russians were very, very excited to negotiate to make sure that the Americans and the Chinese were not too close. The result of this was a series of treaties, like the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which limited the development of anti-ballistic missiles, meaning you are limited from developing technology which shoots down other missiles. It stops the arms race in terms of nuclear buildup. Now, the other thing that the Russians gave us was help with Vietnam. Oh, Jesus, running out of time. All right, let me just go through this quick. Yeah, all right. Nixon wanted to get out of Vietnam. He wanted to give more guns and support to the South Vietnamese army to defend their country, but pull American troops out. This was called Vietnamization. He also wanted to increase the bombings of Vietnam in order to make the South Vietnam army more capable of defending itself and defeating the communists. The result of this increased bombing of North Vietnam, the intensity of the Vietnam War, was a growth of anti-war protests in America. For instance, in 1970, 350 colleges experienced strikes or demonstrations against the war. 350 colleges in this country. Troops were called out and occupied 21 different campuses because things had gotten so out of control in 21 different campuses. On May 4th, 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, things got so bad that the National Guard were called out during an anti-war demonstration, and they opened fire on 4 students and killed them. 2 weeks later, in Jackson State University in Mississippi, 2 other students, this time black, were shot in an anti-war demonstration. But the war was ruining morale. The soldiers in Vietnam increasingly didn't want to be there, and discipline was crumbling. Most of the soldiers were high. Many of the soldiers were just high just to deal with the pressures of being there. Congress passes the War Powers Act, and it forces the president to get congressional approval to send any more troops, because Congress recognizes the American people don't want more troops in Vietnam. But other reasons why anti-war sentiment went so high was revelations of the My Lai massacre. The My Lai massacre involved, in 1968, U.S. troops massacring an entire village, My Lai, 350 men, women, and children, on suspicion that they were aiding the communists. Oops, okay, not here. There is a photo that was printed on the front page of the newspaper, one of the largest national newspapers, which showed a clump of bodies in the middle of a dirt road. These were the dead from the My Lai massacre piled in a clump in the middle of a dirt road, and it was on the cover of the national newspapers as proof of the massacre of these soldiers. Proof of the massacre by the soldiers. That, in addition to this, the publication of what's known as the Pentagon Papers in 1971 destroyed the credibility of the government. What do I mean by that? The Pentagon Papers were a series of papers that were essentially, these are government documents acquired by the New York Times, which detailed exactly what the government was doing in Vietnam secretly for the past 35 years. And they detailed what they'd been doing and the American people had been kept in the dark about. So now the government looks to be failure in the war. They're massacring civilians, and they've been discovered to be lying to the American people for the last 35 years. The Vietnam War destroyed American people's faith in their government was ever telling them the truth about anything. I'm going to stop it there. We've gone late, and we'll just finish this up next class.